There's something that happens to experienced professionals in the middle of all the AI disruption that almost no one talks about. Not the anxiety, not the stress about keeping up, or the pressure to learn new tools, or the low-grade dread that shows up on Sunday evenings. Something older than all of that, and heavier. The reason it's been so hard to carry is that nobody has given it the right name. Most of the content out there calls it anxiety, calls it resistance, calls it fear of change. And those words are close, but they're not precise enough. And when the word isn't precise, the thing it's pointing to stays invisible. What this video is going to do is name it precisely, because the right name doesn't just describe what you've been feeling. It opens a path through it that the wrong name doesn't. Here is what's actually been happening. At some point in the last year or two, maybe gradually, maybe in a single moment, something shifted in how your professional life felt. Not your performance, not your relationships at work, not the quality of what you produce. Something harder to locate than any of those things. It's the feeling that the career arc you were tracking, the one you'd been building toward for 15 or 20 years, is no longer exactly where you left it. The unspoken assumption that expertise compounds. That the longer you do skilled work well, the more valuable that skill becomes. That the rules you mastered would keep paying off. That assumption got quietly disrupted, and what followed wasn't just anxiety about the future. It was something that looked backward as well as forward, a sense of loss for the professional certainty you had, for the version of your career that made sense, for the competence you built carefully over real time that now feels like it's being depreciated in ways you didn't agree to and weren't asked about. That feeling has a name. It's grief, not anxiety, not resistance, not fear of technology. Grief. And the reason that distinction matters, the reason it's worth saying that specific word, is that grief and anxiety are not the same thing, and they don't respond to the same things. Anxiety is about an uncertain future. It responds to information, to action, to evidence that the feared outcome can be avoided. Grief is about a real loss that has already happened. It doesn't respond to information. It doesn't go away when you learn more or plan better. It responds to being named, to being witnessed, to being moved through rather than managed. If you've been trying to treat grief like anxiety, consuming information, making plans, taking courses, and finding that none of it quiets the thing underneath, that's not a failure of discipline. That's what happens when you apply the wrong remedy to the right wound. There's a reason this hasn't been named clearly. Not in the content you've watched, not in the conversations at work, maybe not even in the ones you've had with yourself. Professional grief doesn't have a recognized place in the culture. We have language for grief when someone dies, when a relationship ends, when something is visibly, dramatically lost. We don't have language for the grief of watching the rules change, for the quiet loss of professional certainty, for the experience of expertise that was real, measurably, demonstrably real, becoming something that the world is suddenly less certain it needs in the form you built it. And because there's no language for it, most professionals do something very understandable with it. They reframe it as a motivation problem. They tell themselves they should be further along, that they should have started sooner, that the discomfort they feel is resistance, something to push through, overcome, outrun with enough discipline. And so they consume more content, take another free course, tell themselves this weekend they'll actually start. And the thing underneath the grief doesn't move because it was never a motivation problem. Research on professional identity disruption is consistent on this point. When the expertise that defines someone's sense of professional self is threatened or destabilized, the psychological response is not primarily anxiety. It is loss. It mirrors, structurally, the response to other recognized forms of grief, and it resists resolution through the same channels. You aren't failing to cope. You were grieving. And no one told you that was what was happening. Here is what the grief is actually for, because it helps to be specific. It's for the career arc you were tracking. The one that made sense. The one where expertise compounded and the rules were stable enough to build on. It's for the professional certainty you had. The feeling of knowing your craft well enough that you could move through your work with confidence rather than calculation. It's for the version of competence you spent years building. The one that felt secure. The one that was supposed to keep paying off. Those are real things to lose. The loss of them is not sentimental. It is not weakness. It is not failure to adapt. It is the correct emotional response to something that genuinely changed. Fast, without warning, and without asking. Here is the thing that nobody says clearly enough. And it needs to be said directly. The grief you've been carrying is not a malfunction. It is accuracy. The research on this keeps pointing to something that feels counterintuitive at first. The professionals who experience the most acute disruption in this moment are often the ones who built the most, not the ones who coasted. Not the ones who were already phoning it in. The ones who took their expertise seriously. Who built real competence over real time. Who had the most to lose when the rules changed because they had invested the most in understanding exactly what the rules were. The disorientation you feel is proportional to the expertise you built. That is not a coincidence. The ground moved, not because you stood still, not because you failed to pay attention, not because something was always wrong with you that the disruption has now revealed. The ground moved because it moved. At a rate that is, by any honest measure, historically unprecedented. The last few years represent the fastest professional skill displacement in recorded memory. The tools that were stable reference points in your field for a decade are being rewritten inside of months. The people who feel the most disoriented in this moment are not the people who did something wrong. They're the people who were paying close attention to a ground that is no longer where they last checked. There is a grief in that. A specific, legitimate grief. For the professional certainty you had, the feeling of being sure of your footing in your own field. For the career arc that made sense, the one where the next decade looked like a reasonable extension of the last two. For the expertise that was supposed to be the safest thing you owned. The thing that couldn't be outsourced or replaced. The thing you built because it was supposed to be immune to exactly this kind of disruption. And here is what I want to say about that grief. Directly, without softening it. It is legitimate, not as a stage to move through as quickly as possible, not as an obstacle on the way to resilience, not as something to process privately so you can get back to being productive. Legitimate, as in, it makes complete sense, as in, it is the correct response to what actually happened, as in, you are not behind the people who don't appear to be feeling it. You may simply be more honest about what's actually true. The grief is not the problem. The grief being unnamed is the problem. Because unnamed grief doesn't process. It loops. It shows up as the Sunday anxiety and the nodding in meetings and the courses started and abandoned and the quiet sense that something is wrong with you specifically. When what's actually wrong is that something real was lost and no one gave you permission to call it that. Naming it doesn't make the loss disappear. But it changes everything about what you can do next. If what's been named in this video has been sitting somewhere you couldn't reach, if what's been blocking the information and the courses and the tools isn't discipline, but something older than that, there's a resource in the description built specifically for this moment. Not another AI tutorial, not a productivity framework. A guided process for moving through the emotional layer that has been making everything else harder to absorb, so that when you do take the next practical step, it actually lands. It's called the AI Shame Reset. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Grief moves through acknowledgement. That sounds almost too simple to say, but it's what the research on professional identity disruption actually shows. And it's what tends to get skipped in a culture that treats emotional processing as a detour from the real work. Acknowledging grief is not the same as dwelling in it. It is not sentimentality. It is not the opposite of action. It is what makes action possible. There is an objection that's probably already formed, because it's the objection this audience almost always carries. This is self-indulgent. I should just get on with it. And that instinct makes complete sense. It's what competent professionals have been trained to do, to feel something, note it, and move past it toward what needs to be done. The problem is that when the thing being felt is grief, specifically grief, moving past it without moving through it doesn't work the way it works with other emotions. Grief that gets skipped doesn't disappear. It becomes the thing underneath everything else. The ambient weight that makes every practical step feel heavier than it should. The reason the courses don't stick. The reason the tools feel like they're for someone else. The reason that knowing what to do and doing it keep being different things. Moving through it is faster than moving around it. Not dramatically faster. Not in a way that announces itself, but the professional who has given the grief its name, who has sat with it long enough to feel the weight of what was actually lost, is more ready for the next step than the one who is still white-knuckling through content while the unnamed thing underneath keeps pulling them back. So here is the one thing to do before the end of this week. Not an AI tutorial. Not a course to enroll in. Not a tool to open. Find 10 minutes, alone, without a screen, and write down in your own words what you've actually lost. Not what you're afraid of losing. What has already changed. The career arc that's shifted. The professional certainty that was there and now isn't. The version of competence you built that the moment is asking you to renegotiate. Write it down like it's a real loss. Because it is. That's not a delay on the path through this. That is the path through this. If this video opens something that you want to take further, if you're ready to move from naming it to actually working through it, the resource in the description and the pinned comment was built for exactly this next step. What's the specific thing you've been grieving that you've never been able to say out loud at work? And what would be different if you could? So here is what you actually have at the end of this. Not a tool, not a technique, a name. And the name is grief. Not anxiety, not resistance, not failure to adapt quickly enough. Grief. For the professional certainty you had, for the career arc that made sense, for the expertise you built, in good faith, over real years, that the moment is asking you to hold differently than you expected. That name matters because grief has a shape, it has a direction. It has things that help it move and things that keep it stuck. And the first thing that helps it move is calling it what it is, not managing it under a different label, not outrunning it with enough information, not treating it like a motivation problem when it is something much older and more specific than that. The ground moved. Not because you weren't paying attention. Not because something was always true about you that this moment is finally exposed. Not because your best years happened before you noticed and the door has closed on recovery. The ground moved because it moved. At a pace that is genuinely without precedent. And the grief you've been carrying, the unnamed weight of it, is not the proof that you can't adapt. It is the proof that what you built was real. Real things, lost, are worth grieving. And grief, named, witnessed, moved through rather than managed, is not the opposite of what comes next. It is how you get there. The thing worth holding from this is not a step, it's a sentence. The grief is correct. It is not a malfunction. It is accuracy. And once that lands, once it actually lands, the next step becomes possible in a way it hasn't been before. That sentence is yours to use. Before Tuesday,